It was another day of whiplash in Washington as President Trump addressed a looming government shutdown, the proposed GOP tax overhaul, and North Korea. The UN Security Council is set to meet Wednesday after Pyongyang launched a ballistic missile into the Sea of Japan. The move escalated already high tensions with the U.S., but President Trump told reporters this won't change his approach in dealing with the regime.
Nothing changed. Nothing changed. We have a very serious approach, and nothing changed. We take it very seriously.
Meanwhile, the GOP tax plan is inching closer to reality. The Senate Budget Committee on Tuesday approved the proposed legislation along party lines. And President Trump took another shot at Democratic congressional leaders after they refused to meet with him at the White House, following a tweet from Mr. Trump.
They decided not to show up. They've been all talk and they've been no action.
For more on the president's comments and the bipartisan clash, here's Nancy Cordes.
Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi did not show up for our meeting today.
The president held an impromptu photo op today, flanked by two empty chairs, to signify his displeasure after the two top Democrats canceled on him.
They've been all talk and they've been no action. And now it's even worse. Now it's not even talk.
They were supposed to discuss government funding, which is set to run out next week. But the Democrats called it a waste of time after President Trump attacked them on Twitter and said, "I don't see a deal."
You're never going to stop the president from tweeting. So does this mean that going forward you're not planning to sit down with him?
All he has to do is say he's serious and wants to undergo a real negotiation, and we'll sit down with him.
Mr. Trump did get to put his deal-making to the test over lunch with Senate Republicans, where he sparred with senators who still have concerns about the party's tax plan. Wisconsin's Ron Johnson thinks the tax cuts favor corporations at the expense of small businesses.
I thought it was a fine, dandy exchange. I didn't feel threatened at all.
Tennessee's Bob Corker worries about what the $1.5 trillion plan would do to the deficit.
I'm just trying to ensure that we put in place a policy that's great for future generations.
So Republican leaders are furiously making changes.
Think of sitting there with a Rubik's Cube, trying to get to 50.
The bill did clear a logistical hurdle today.
The ayes are 12.
Passing out of the Budget Committee over the objections of protesters and Democrats.
This legislation is a disastrous and unfair piece of legislation which gives huge tax breaks to the people who need it the least.
GOP leaders are hoping to hold a vote on their Senate tax plan this week, but they can't do that, Elaine, until they know that they have won over most of the 10 or so Republican holdouts.
Well, at this point, Nancy, do we know how close are Republicans to getting this plan passed, and what kind of compromises are on the table?
Well, the challenge is that these 10 or so Republicans don't all have the same concerns. There are several, for example, who, like Bob Corker, worry about the impact on the debt and the deficit, and they are arguing for some kind of trigger or stopgap that would click into place if the very ambitious projections that Republicans have made about how much growth this tax plan is going to spur don't end up panning out. So they want some kind of measure that would say, okay, if we are not generating new revenue as a result of this tax plan, we want to freeze those tax cuts so we don't, really just drive a whole new hole in the deficit. That's something that concerns Republican leaders. They think that it would create a lot of uncertainty for individuals and for businesses. So they're in talks with that small group of Republicans about that. And then you've got a couple of them who, like Ron Johnson, worry about what it means for small businesses. And so the challenge that they have, and the reason that Mitch McConnell said it's almost like solving a Rubik's Cube, is that if they make changes to satisfy some members, there's always a possibility possibility that they could end up creating new opponents. And so they're trying to do all this even as they're still hoping that they can hold a vote this week. Because remember, after this bill passes the Senate, they still need to try to reconcile the large number of differences between the Senate plan and the House plan, and then that has to go back to the House and Senate for a vote, all in time for the president's imposed deadline, which is Christmas.
Well, Nancy, as a potential government shutdown looms, what could the consequences be if a spending deal is not reached?
Well, there are a few different possibilities. If they can't reach any kind of a deal whatsoever, you're always looking at the possibility of a government shutdown. Normally, Democrats and Republicans make a lot of threats, but then manage to head that off. There's also the possibility that they could essentially throw in the towel and say, okay, well, let's just pass a short-term stopgap measure, maybe to buy ourselves another week or two to come up with a negotiated deal, or maybe even let's do it for a month, kick it until after the holidays, and then come back to the table. That's something that Democrats and Republicans alike don't like to do. It creates a lot of uncertainty for the military in particular, for other government agencies when their funding levels are in doubt. And so what they're hoping is that they could strike a long-term deal, but that is only going to happen if Democrats get some kind of assurance from Republicans that they are going to tackle the issue of the so-called dreamers, people who have been brought to this country illegally as children. And if it's not going to actually be wrapped into the funding bill itself, they want some kind of promise in exchange for their votes on the funding bill that Republicans will tackle it in another package very soon.
Nancy, on another topic, I know you have new information about Congressman John Conyers, a Democrat of Michigan, who is facing allegations of sexual misconduct. What can you tell us?
Well, he has been in meetings with some of his fellow members of the Congressional Black Caucus to discuss whether he should resign in light of these allegations by former staffers that he made multiple and repeated unwanted sexual advances. He had already announced over the weekend that he was going to step aside from his leadership post on the House Judiciary Committee, but that was not enough for a number of fellow Democrats who felt that, if they are going to take a zero tolerance policy on sexual harassment when it comes to Republicans, they need to do the same when it comes to their own members. And in fact, Congressman James Clyburn of South Carolina told us that it's his understanding that a fifth accuser has either come forward or is about to come forward, which would obviously create even more of a drumbeat for Conyers to take more dramatic action. We're still waiting to hear from Conyers himself about all of this, but I can tell you there is a growing sense among Democrats, many of them who revere Conyers as a civil rights icon and one of the longest-serving members of Congress, that perhaps, given the pileup of accusations against him, that perhaps the best thing for him to do would be to resign.
All right, more to come on that front. I know you'll be watching it. Nancy Cordes on Capitol Hill for us. Nancy, thank you.
You're welcome.